There's a particular kind of quiet that only exists between 4 and 5 in the morning. Not silence. Silence is an absence. This is something else. This is the world holding its breath, like it knows something is coming and it doesn't want to ruin it. I know that quiet well. Too well, maybe. I've stood in it for 11 years. His name was Sergeant Marcus Ellison, 34 years old, born in Derbyshire to a man who fixed boilers and a woman who taught primary school and believed with her whole chest that her son was going to do something that mattered. He joined the household cavalry at 22, not because he dreamed of it, not the way the recruitment posters suggest men dream of it, all gleaming breastplates and horses and ceremony, but because it was the straightest line between where he was and where he needed to be, and Marcus Ellison had always been a man who moved in straight lines. 11 years of straight lines. 11 years of 4 a.m. And not once, not a single morning in 4,000 and something dawns had he ever stood in that pre-light and thought, look at that. He always had somewhere to be, something to check, someone counting on him to be precisely where his boots were supposed to be, doing precisely what his rank required. The sunrise was always happening behind what he was doing. A backdrop, set dressing, the sky just doing its job while he did his. He never blamed it. That was the work. That was the life he'd chosen and rechosen every morning when the alarm went at 3:45 and he sat on the edge of his bed in the dark and decided again to stand up. But here's what happened on a Tuesday in late September, in the kind of autumn that makes London look like it was painted by someone who was just showing off. Marcus was on leave. Actual leave. Not the kind where you're technically off duty, but your phone is on and your kid is pressed and ready, and you're sitting in civilian clothes feeling like a man wearing a costume. Real leave. 2 weeks. His first in, he had to count backwards, genuinely count, 19 months. His mother had said, go somewhere, Marcus. For the love of God, just go somewhere that isn't a barracks or my kitchen. So he'd come to London, which his mother pointed out was arguably worse, because London was where he worked, where he'd spent a decade of his life standing at attention outside buildings most people only saw on tea towels. But he'd come anyway. He'd booked a room in a small hotel on a side street near St. James's Park. Not the grand ones, not the ones with the livery doorman, just a clean, quiet room on the 3rd floor with a window that faced east, and he told himself he was going to rest. He was not particularly good at resting. The first day he walked. Just walked. No route, no timing, no purpose, which felt so alien he kept checking his watch before remembering there was nothing to check it for. He walked along the mall and past the palace gates, and he noticed, almost irritably, how different it looked from this side. From outside the gate, just a building. A very large, very famous building with tourists pressing their faces to the iron and holding their phones up and waiting for something to happen. He'd been the thing they waited for all these years. He'd been the ceremony. It was strange to be on this side of the iron. A child near him, 6, maybe 7, red wellies, a hat with a pom-pom, pointed at a guardsman in position near the gate and said to her father, Daddy, does he ever blink? Marcus almost answered. Old habit. He walked on. The second day, it rained, and he sat in a cafe with a newspaper he didn't read and a coffee he let go cold, watching the window run with water, and he felt strange. Not sad, not happy, just unmoored, like a man who'd been gripping a rope for so long that when someone finally took the rope away, his hands didn't know what to do with themselves. They just stayed curled, waiting. He thought about calling someone. Collins, maybe, his closest thing to a friend inside the regiment. A big Yorkshireman who laughed like a drain being unblocked and told terrible jokes, and had once 3 years ago, in a moment that neither of them had ever referenced since, sat with Marcus for 2 hours in a hospital corridor without saying a single word, just sat there while Marcus waited for news about his father. His father was fine in the end. A scare. That's what they called it. A scare. Marcus didn't call Collins. He finished the cold coffee and went back to the hotel and watched television programs he couldn't later have named, and went to sleep at 9:15, which was either deeply sad or deeply healthy, and he genuinely couldn't tell which. The third day, he woke at 3:47 a.m. Old habit, bone deep. His body didn't own an alarm. It had become one. He lay in the dark of the hotel room for a while. The ceiling was plain white. There was a small water stain in one corner that looked, if you were in the right mood, slightly like the outline of a dog. He was in the right mood. He could hear the city, or rather, he could hear what the city sounded like when it wasn't performing. When the tourists were in their beds, and the street performers had packed their cases, and the buses were running empty routes through empty roads. There was a low, distant hum, the M-way, maybe, or the underground doing whatever the underground does in the hours when no one is riding it. And above that, nothing, or the closest to nothing London ever gets. He should go back to sleep. He lay there for 11 minutes, knowing he wasn't going to. He dressed in the dark. Jeans. A gray jumper his mother had given him 2 Christmases ago that he'd never worn because it wasn't a barracks-appropriate garment, and also because it was absurdly comfortable, and comfort for a long time had felt like a thing he wasn't supposed to trust. He pulled it over his head, and it smelled faintly of the cedar blocks his mother kept in her wardrobe, which was the smell of every home he'd ever gone back to, and he had to stand still for a moment with his eyes closed. He put his jacket on, walked out. St. James's Park at 4:30 in the morning is not a place most people know exists. It's the same park, technically. Same trees, same lake, same pelicans who behave as though they own the place, and are correct about this. But without the people, it becomes something else. Something that feels older, like it remembers being countryside, like it's only tolerating the city out of politeness. Marcus walked along the path by the water, and his footsteps were very loud. He wasn't used to that. He was trained to move quietly, controlled, deliberate, the footfall of a man who knows where every foot is landing before it lands. But loud a way that felt noticed. The park noticed him. A moorhen somewhere in the reeds noticed him. The dark water, perfectly still in the windless cold, noticed him. He stopped at the bridge, the little blue bridge in the center of the park, the one that tourists love to photograph because it frames the palace perfectly, that particular composition that ends up in approximately 40% of all London postcards. And he stopped because there was no reason to keep walking. He had no destination. He had nowhere to be. That thought again, arriving like it kept having to reintroduce itself. Nowhere to be. He put his hands on the railing. The metal was cold through his palms. He looked east, over the trees, over the rooftops of Whitehall, and whatever was stacked behind Whitehall, toward where the sky should eventually do something. It wasn't doing anything yet. Just dark. The deep specific dark of 4:40 a.m., which is different from midnight dark. Midnight dark is dense, settled in, committed. This was dark with a kind of restlessness in it, like it knew its tenure was nearly up. He waited. He didn't know he was waiting. He thought he was just standing. The first change came at something like 4:47, and it wasn't a color so much as a decision. Like the sky had made up its mind. A line appeared, thin as a thread, horizontal, sitting right along the tops of the eastern buildings, and it wasn't light yet, not really, more the idea of light, the word light before the thing itself, and it was the precise color of, he stood there trying to find a word for it. It was the color of something his mother would describe, and he'd roll his eyes at. She would have said, the color of a promise, love. He did not roll his eyes. He stood very still, because it was moving, slowly, and then faster than slowly, that thread of not quite light was pulling the dark upward like someone lifting a heavy curtain from the bottom, and the sky behind it was not pink, not orange. Those were tourist words, postcard words. It was something burning and patient at the same time, a color you'd only ever mix by accident and could never reproduce on purpose. The water below him caught it. That was the thing that got him. The water. The lake just opened itself to it, lay flat, and took all that early color and held it perfectly without a ripple like it had been practicing. Like this was its entire function, this 1 minute of every day, and all the hours of flatness before this were just the preparation. Marcus Ellison, sergeant, household cavalry, age 34, stood on a bridge in an empty park in the pre-dawn cold and felt something move through his chest that he did not have a word for. Not emotion, exactly. Bigger than emotion. Or before it. The place emotion comes from before it's named. He thought, I have watched this happen 10,000 times. And then, 3 seconds later, the second thought, arriving like a delayed train. Have I? Had he? He stood there and tried to genuinely remember. A specific morning. A specific sunrise. Not the general smear of years and early alarms and parade grounds and cold and the sound of boots, a specific one. One morning where he had stood somewhere and thought this here, this light. He came up empty. Every sunrise he could recall was attached to something. The thing he was doing when the light came up. The position he was about to take. The ceremony that was starting. The inspection. The route. The date. The dignitary. The crowds already gathering at 6 in the morning with their flags and their flasks and their cheerful, freezing cold determination to witness history, which was really just the word they used for ritual, for the comfort of things being done the same way they'd always been done. He had watched 10,000 sunrises through the frame of duty. He had never, not once, just watched one. This thought sat on his sternum like a hand pressing down. Not hard, not painful, just present, insistent. You have been standing in this light for 11 years, it said, and you never once let it land on you. He stayed on the bridge until the pink burned into gold and the gold went white, and the day arrived, unremarkably, the way days always do, not with fanfare, but with gradual, inevitable normalcy, light just becoming the new state of things, dark receding like it had an appointment elsewhere. By 6:15, the first joggers came. A woman with a yellow dog. A man in a high-vis vest emptying a bin nearby, his cart's wheels squeaking on the path in a steady, pleasant rhythm. The park began remembering it was a park again. Marcus stepped back from the railing. His hands were red from the cold metal. He hadn't noticed the cold while it was happening. He started walking. No direction, just away from the bridge, and into the morning, and into the strange new weight of the question his own chest had just asked him. How many things have you looked at without ever seeing? He didn't try to answer it. He just walked. She was already there when he came back the next morning. Same bridge. 4:52 a.m. He'd come back because he didn't have a good reason. He'd sat in the hotel room the evening before eating a cheese sandwich he'd bought from a Pret that was inexplicably still open at 9 p.m., watching the city go dark through his east-facing window, and when he'd gone to sleep at 10, he'd thought, tomorrow I'll do something useful. Walk somewhere. A gallery. Maybe. His mother was always on at him about galleries. His body had other plans. 3:47 a.m., wide awake, ceiling, the dog-shaped water stain. Same as before. He put the jumper back on. The cedar smell again. Down the stairs, out the door, through streets, so quiet they felt borrowed from a different, slower city, and into the park. And she was there on his bridge. She was 70, maybe a little more. Small woman, the kind of small that doesn't seem diminished, just concentrated. A thick coat the color of old moss. Wellies, the green ones, the proper country ones, slightly muddy in a way that suggested she'd come a long way or didn't care about concrete. White hair, pulled back severely except for 2 pieces at the front that had given up and were doing their own thing in the cold air. She had a bag. A cloth bag, the reusable kind, stretch full and heavy. She was reaching into it and pulling out something, fish he realized when he was closer. Small fish, not throwing them. Placing them very deliberately on the railing of the bridge, spaced out with the seriousness of someone setting a formal table. He stopped a few feet away. She didn't look up. You're back, she said. He blinked. Saw thee. You were here yesterday. She placed another fish, standing at the other end. You stayed a long time. He'd thought he was alone. The awareness of having been seen, in what he'd considered a private moment, did a small, uncomfortable thing to his neck. I was just walking, he said, which was half true. She reached into the bag. People say that. Usually means they were thinking. He didn't have an answer for that, so he didn't give one. You can stay, she said. They'll come in a minute regardless. You're not loud enough to bother them. The pelicans? And the herons. The herons are shyer. Stand still, and they'll come anyway. She looked up at him for the first time. Brown eyes, very direct. The eyes of a woman who had decided somewhere around decade 6 of her life that she didn't have time for social pretense. You're not a bird person. No, he admitted. Doesn't matter. They don't know that. He stood still. She placed the fish. And he'll tell you, though he's not a man who uses the word remarkable often, the herons came. Two of them, enormous, gray, and prehistoric, dropping out of the pre-dawn air with the slow, deliberate wing beat of things that have been doing this since before London existed. They landed on the railing 6 feet away and folded themselves up and waited. Regal, entirely unbothered by Marcus's presence in the way that only very large birds and very confident people can be unbothered. One of them looked at him. One long yellow eye. He looked back. "They've been coming here for 8 years, the woman said. "To this bridge. Same spot. Whatever the season. Every morning? Every morning I'm here. And how often are you here?" She paused in her reaching, seemed to consider the question. "For years ago, I would have said most mornings. Now I say every morning." She pulled out another fish. "My husband died 4 years ago." He said, "I'm sorry." "The days got longer," she said, simply. "So the mornings got earlier. You do the math." He didn't say anything. He understood the math. Not from loss exactly. Not yet. Not the way she meant it. But from the other thing, the version that comes from spending so long in service that the hours outside of it feel oversized and unfamiliar, like clothes that don't fit a body you've been remaking year by year. They stood in a quiet that was a different kind of quiet from the one he'd stood in the day before. That had been solitude. This was company, but the loose kind, the kind that doesn't require constant maintenance. He couldn't remember the last time he'd stood in a quiet like that with another person. "What do you do?" she asked eventually. "Household cavalry." He paused. "I'm on leave." She looked at him sidelong. "How long?" 11 years. 12 in February. "I meant to leave." "Oh." He almost smiled. "Almost. 2 weeks. First real one in a while, I'm guessing." He looked at the heron, who was still looking at him with that yellow glass eye. 19 months. She made a sound. Not quite disapproval. More like recognition. "My husband was a doctor. GP. 42 years. He retired at 68 and was dead at 71. She said flat, not brutally, just as a fact she'd had time to carry. He didn't know how to stop working, so his body found a way to stop him. Marcus felt the weight of that land somewhere specific and unpleasant. He missed the sunrises, she continued. He'd say that, in those last years, that he'd missed them, not metaphorically. He'd literally been asleep through them most of his life because he'd worked nights and slept days, or he'd been working when it happened and never looked up from whatever he was doing. He said it like it was a small thing. She put the last fish down, folded the bag. "I don't think it was a small thing." Marcus thought about that on the way back to the hotel. He thought about it through the breakfast he made himself from the small complimentary basket, a dry croissant, a small jar of apricot jam he hadn't noticed before and which was extremely good, and he thought about it in the shower and while he was putting his boots on. Except he wasn't putting his boots on for anything. He was putting them on because that's what he did when he got dressed. The muscle memory of it, the routine, the sequence, the way a body fills its own shape when the shape has been the same long enough, was so deep he'd done it without thinking. He sat on the edge of the bed with his boots on and nowhere to go. The room was very quiet. He thought about the doctor. 71. 42 years of someone else's emergencies at all hours, and then 3 years of not knowing what to do with his own hands, and then his heart just decided that was enough. He thought, that is not going to be me. And then, almost immediately, how would I know if it was? He called his mother at 9. She picked up before the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, and probably had been since 6, and had almost certainly already done the crossword, and made the shopping list, and watered the tomatoes she grew on the windowsill that never produced anything, but which she maintained with the devotion of someone who believed persistence was its own reward. "Marcus." Her voice had that sound it got when she was trying not to sound too pleased. Like warmth pretending to be neutral. "You're up." "I'm up." "How's the room?" "Fine." "Good. There's a water stain that looks like a dog. That's either charming or it means the roof's leaking." A pause. "Are you eating?" "I had a croissant." "That's not eating." "Mum, I'm just saying." He could hear her settle into her chair, the one she always sat in by the kitchen window. He could picture the mug of tea, the specific mug, the one with the slightly chipped rim that she'd had since before he was born and refused to replace on principle. Are you resting? He almost said yes. The automatic answer. The answer you give when someone asks how you are, and what they're actually doing is asking if they need to worry about you, and you've gotten very good at the word that makes them not worry. He said instead, I watched the sunrise this morning. She was quiet for a second. Was it nice? He thought about the thread of light above the rooftops, the water opening itself to the color, the heron with the yellow eye. Yeah, he said. It was. Another pause, the kind she'd been capable of since he was small, where she said nothing and somehow said everything. The pause that meant, I know there's more. Take your time. I'm here. I don't think I've ever done it before, he said. Not properly. Not without something I was supposed to be doing. She didn't say, oh, Marcus. She didn't say that sad. She didn't do any of the things that would have made him sorry he'd said it. She said, well, you got 2 weeks. He went back to the park at noon when the light was flat and bright and the tourists had arrived in force, and the pelicans were performing their strange ambassador of the lake routine, allowing children to photograph them with the air of minor celebrities tolerating the public. He walked the same path he'd walked in the dark, and it was entirely different. Not worse, just different. Populated where it had been empty, loud where it had been still. He sat on a bench near the lake and watched people. A father and daughter, maybe 9 years old, feeding bread to the ducks in that semi-frantic way, where the daughter was throwing it too fast, and the ducks were not keeping up, and the bread was piling up in the water, and the father was laughing, and the daughter was not finding it funny yet, but would remember it as funny later. A pair of tourists, early 20s, sitting on the grass with a map between them, both pointing in different directions, neither of them looking at the lake, neither of them noticing that a pelican was standing 4 feet away, examining their backpack with the gravity of a customs official. He watched the pelican. The pelican moved on. An old man, late 80s perhaps, moving slowly with a stick, wearing a proper coat with proper buttons, the kind of old man who takes getting dressed seriously, sat on the bench next to Marcus without preamble and looked at the lake and said to no one in particular, crisp today. It is, Marcus agreed. Good day for it. For what? The old man considered. For being outside. He squinted at the water. For being anywhere, really, when you get to my age. They sat together in the flat noon light, 2 men with nothing in common except the bench and the view, and Marcus felt something in his chest ease like a knot choosing to be less of a knot, and it was so unfamiliar that he almost reached up to check if something was physically different. Nothing was physically different. He was just sitting on a bench on a Tuesday without anything attached to it. The woman with the coat the color of old moss was named Doreen. He didn't find this out until the 3rd morning on the bridge, when she was already there with her fish and her bag and her herons, and she introduced herself as though they were meeting for the first time, which was both very formal and somehow exactly right. Marcus, he said, and she nodded as though she'd guessed and been proven correct. Military name, she said. My mother liked the sound of it. Nothing more heroic than that. She smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that doesn't show all its teeth because it doesn't need to. My husband was named Leonard. He always said it was a name that sounded better in other people's mouths than his own. Did you agree? I thought it suited him perfectly. But you never see your own name the way other people do. She placed a fish. You see yourself the way your mother does, or the way your sergeant major does, or the way you felt at your worst moment. Never accurate. Never the full picture. He thought about that. How do you see yourself, he asked. He wasn't sure why he asked it. It wasn't a question he asked people. She didn't seem surprised by it. As someone who came back to this bridge after Leonard died, she said. Every morning, even when it was hard, even when the dark was very dark. She looked at the water. That's how I see myself now. Not who I was when he was alive. Who I became when he wasn't. The sky behind the buildings was doing its thing again. The thread of light, thicker today. There was something different in the angle. September becoming October, the light arriving from a slightly different direction each morning. Not obvious, not dramatic, just the slow planetary fact of the season turning. He'd never noticed before that the angle changed. Of course it changed. He knew this. He'd learned it in school, in physics, in basic orientation training. the earth tilting on its axis, the sun arc dropping as autumn came. He had known it and never noticed it. The fourth morning he brought coffee, a thermos from the hotel breakfast room that he'd filled and carried without quite acknowledging to himself why he was carrying it. 2 cups. Doreen looked at the thermos, then at him. "You didn't have to," she said. "I was making it anyway," he said, which they both understood was not entirely true. They stood on the bridge with their cups, and their fish, and their herons, and the sky going through its particular alchemy. The thread, the burning, the patience, the water, catching everything the sky offered. And Marcus drank his coffee, and felt for perhaps the first time in recent memory, like he was doing the right thing by doing nothing. It was such a small feeling. He didn't want to disturb it by naming it. On the 7th morning, he didn't go to the bridge. Not because he didn't wake up. 3:47. Same as always, his body as reliable as a signal clock. And not because the morning wasn't there cold and clear through the curtain gap, the sky already doing its preliminary work in the east. He woke up and he lay there and he thought about the bridge and Doreen and the herons and the coffee thermos and the particular quality of the light at 4:52 against the water. And then he thought, what if I went somewhere different? The thought surprised him. Not the idea itself. It was a simple enough idea, but the feeling underneath it. The small tremor of something adjacent to excitement. Not the performed enthusiasm he'd learned to muster for certain ceremonial occasions. The calibrated public pride that was part of the job. Something quieter. Something that didn't need an audience. He got dressed. He went somewhere different. He went to the river. Not the tourist part. Not the embankment with the eye on one end and the Tate on the other and the bridges everyone photographs. He walked east along the south bank until the brunch spots and the bookstalls thinned out and the path got quieter and the buildings got less self-conscious, and he found a stretch of river wall with a bench and nothing on the opposite bank except some industrial something behind chain link, very ordinary, not scenic by any conventional measure. He sat down. The Thames at 5 a.m. in late September, going out on the tide. It sounds like breathing. Slow. Heavy. The occasional slap of water against stone. A buoy somewhere with a soft, persistent bell. The kind of sound that belongs to old navigation, old habits of water. A single light on the far bank. Static, amber, maybe a warehouse window, maybe a security light. It didn't matter. The sky opened above the buildings to the east. No bridge to frame it here. No perfect composition, no postcard in sight. Just open sky above an indifferent city, going from dark to the color of something bruised, and then past bruised into rose, and then into the particular orange gold that London gets when the light hits the particulate in the air, the exhaust, and the river damp, and the million human exhalations of 8 million sleeping people. It hit the water. The Thames took it differently than a park lake. The lake had been still, had held the color. The river moved. It broke the light into pieces and rearranged them constantly, sent them away downstream and brought new ones, never the same configuration twice, never holding the image long enough to settle. Light is process rather than picture. He sat with that for a while. That's the job, he thought. Not immediately, not as a planned metaphor. It arrived the way true things arrive, sideways, without announcement. That's what it's been. Light is process. Always the next moment. Always the next post. Always the next ceremony. The arrangement never settles because you're always moving through it. He sat very still. The river moved. The thing about 11 years, he was starting to understand, sitting on this bench with the cold coming off the water and the light moving on the Thames. The thing about 11 years of early alarms and late nights and the precise architecture of duty that fills every hour with its shape and purpose is that you forget it's filling something. You forget there was something there before it, a before self, the version of you that existed when the days were still unscheduled, still wide and possible and slightly frightening in their openness. He had been 22 when he joined. He tried to picture the 22-year-old Marcus Ellison with any real specificity and found he could barely locate him. The posture was different, that much he knew. He'd carried himself like a question mark then, slightly hunched, slightly uncertain, all his height apologizing for itself. He remembered a girl he'd been seeing at the time, Rachel, from Chesterfield, who wore large earrings and laughed at everything, including things that weren't funny, which he'd found annoying and then missed acutely for about 2 years after she'd eventually stopped ringing. He hadn't thought about Rachel in years. He thought about her now, and it wasn't painful, just the way old photographs aren't painful, just distant, like evidence of a person he'd once been. He wondered if she ever watched the sunrise. He wondered if she'd be surprised that he did. He was on the bench when his phone rang. Not his mother this time. The screen said, Collins. He stared at it, thought about letting it go. His thumb answered before he decided. Ellis. Collins's voice, large as the man himself, carrying the particular energy of someone who was definitely not on the South Bank watching the Thames at 5:15 a.m., but was instead in a regimental mess somewhere, doing something practical. You alive? I'm alive. Where are you? Riverside. Which one? South Bank. East of the eye a bit. A pause. What are you doing there? He looked at the river. The light had shifted again. The orange was fading into the flat brightness of full morning approaching. The dramatic bit nearly over. The day getting on with being the day. Watching the river. Another pause. Longer. Collins thinking. Collins was a better thinker than most people gave him credit for, because Collins was also very loud, and people often mistook loudness for shallowness, which was their error. You all right, mate? Collins said. Not you all right as a greeting. You all right as an actual question. The kind that means, I know something is happening, and I am willing to hear it. Marcus opened his mouth. Closed it. I think so, he said, which was a more honest answer than yes, and a less dramatic answer than what he was actually sitting with. The middle truth. The one you can say on a phone call before you found all the words for the full one. Good. Collins accepted this without pushing. He knew when to push and when not to. It was one of his best qualities. I was ringing because Henderson's leaving. End of October. They're doing a thing Thursday night. What kind of thing? Dinner. Speeches. The full embarrassment. He wants you there if you're back. I'll be back. Good. A pause. You eating properly? My mother already asked me that. And I had a croissant. Jesus, Elise. And an apricot jam that was genuinely exceptional. Collins made the drain unblocking laugh. Right. Well, Thursday. Don't be weird about it. When am I ever weird about it? Every Henderson says something heartfelt. You stare at a fixed point like you're about to be inspected. This was completely accurate. I'll work on it. That's all I ask. Collins paused one more time. Seriously, though, glad you're watching the river. He hung up before Marcus could say anything to that. He went back to the park on the 8th morning. And the 9th. On the 9th morning, the weather turned. Not violently, not a storm, just a low gray lid settling over the city, the kind of overcast that isn't dramatic enough to complain about, just present, just a fact. And the sunrise, such as it was muted. Invisible, almost. The sky lightening from one shade of gray to a marginally less dark shade of gray. The change so gradual, it was less a transition than a slow surrender. He stood on the bridge anyway. No color today, Doreen observed. No, I quite like this though, she said. The gray ones. She looked at the water, which was dull today, flat and silver and unreflective. You can see the structure better. Without the color, you just see the shape of the thing. The water, the trees. The way it's all arranged. He thought about that. I was thinking, he said, that I've been working for 11 years, and I don't know what I look like without it. He didn't know he was going to say that. It arrived out of him the way the good things do. When the conversation has been warm long enough for the door to open without you deliberately opening it. Doreen didn't react with alarm or pity. She just nodded slowly, still looking at the water. Leonard said something like that once. After a particularly long stretch of nights. He said, I've been a doctor so long, I don't know if there's a me underneath it. She placed a fish on the railing. I told him there was. How did you know? Because I could still see him, even when he couldn't. She looked at Marcus briefly. That's what other people are for. On the 10th morning, he took a different path to the bridge and passed, without planning, to the gate of the palace. The one he'd stood outside more times than he could count. His spot. His post. The patch of pavement he'd inhabited through state visits and jubilees and ordinary Tuesday mornings with the crowds and the cameras and the children with pom-pom hats asking if he ever blinked. A guardsman was in position. Young, very young, early 20s. Marcus's old age, his question mark posture before the regiment ironed it into something plumb and vertical. The face completely neutral. Hands right, chin up, eyes front, each breath controlled and invisible. The posture of a man who is not watching anything, because watching is not his assignment. Marcus stood for a moment, on the outside of the gate, just looking. A tourist nearby said to another tourist, "Do you think they get bored?" Her companion said, "They don't blink, so probably not." Marcus kept his face entirely still. Not with effort. It was just what his face did. But inside, something between recognition and grief and pride, the complicated compound feeling of seeing a version of yourself from the outside for the first time. This is what it looked like. All those years. Eyes front, face still, hands right. The world going on around him in all its untidy aliveness while he stood as the visible fixed point it could organize itself around. He'd been the lamppost while the world was the street. He wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a complicated thing or both. He walked on. The last morning of leave was a Thursday. He'd be on a train north at noon for Henderson's thing that evening. And then Friday would be the slow reentry, kit, room, regiment, the shape of the life resuming around him like water refilling a mold. He'd thought about this reentry with something that wasn't quite dread, but lived in the same postal code as dread. A low-grade resistance he hadn't felt before, not before this particular leave, not before the bridge and the river and the gray morning and Doreen and the heron with the yellow eye. He went to the bridge early. For 30, earlier than usual. The sky was extraordinary. He didn't know if it was extraordinary because the weather had set it up perfectly. Clear night before, cold and dry, the air scrubbed clean, or because his eyes were different after 2 weeks of looking at it. Maybe both. Probably both. The color started at 4:43, and he is not a man who reaches for words, but he reached. The closest he came it was the color of the inside of something. Like the sky had turned itself inside out and shown him its actual composition. Reds that were almost biological, purples that had no name in common English, and then the gold, not bright, not flashy, just deep and certain and fully itself, the way a thing is when it has been doing what it does for long enough to stop caring whether anyone is watching. The water took it, held it. The herons came, both of them, and stood on the railing and looked at the light and looked at the water and showed no sign of finding any of this remarkable, which was somehow the right response. Not indifference, presence. Total, uncomplicated presence. The heron doesn't perform the sunrise. It just inhabits the same moment. Doreen arrived at 4:58 with her bag and her fish and her coat the color of old moss. She took one look at the sky and stopped walking, stood still, her bag hanging from her hand. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They stood on the bridge, and the color did what it did, unhurried, indifferent to whether it was witnessed, complete in itself. Then it was over. The gold fading, the light going white, the day arriving in its ordinary, ongoing way. The city waking up around them in the distance. A bus somewhere. A siren. The world resuming. Doreen put the fish down for the herons and poured herself a cup from his thermos without asking, which was the right thing to do and felt like a form of ease he hadn't known he wanted until it arrived. "Last day?" she asked. "Train at noon." She nodded. "Will you come back?" "To the park." He thought about it genuinely. Not the polite answer. The real one. "I don't know when," he said. "But yes." She seemed to consider whether this was enough. "Good," she said, and handed him back his cup. He got back to the hotel at 5:30. Packed his bag, which took 4 minutes because everything he owned fit into one bag and was always packed in the same order, muscle memory all the way down, and sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet room. The water stain on the ceiling. Still shaped like a dog. Still there. He thought, I should tell someone. About the 2 weeks. About what happened here. Not the bridge, exactly, or Doreen, or the herons. Not the facts of it. The thing underneath the facts. The understanding he'd arrived at slowly and without ceremony. the way understandings do when they're real, that he had been living with his eyes pointed at the task and not the light, that the light had been happening anyway, that it would keep happening, that this was not a tragedy, that it was also not nothing. He thought, maybe I won't tell anyone. Maybe I'll just carry it. That felt right, like something you keep folded in a coat pocket rather than framed on a wall. He was on a train by noon. The countryside north of London in October. Barren places, still gold in others, the trees in that uncertain middle state of autumn where they haven't decided yet, holding their color or letting go, the individual tree's own timeline, some of them brilliant, and some of them done, and some of them still green like they hadn't got the memo. He had the window seat. He watched it go by, not cataloging it, not timing it, not counting anything, just watching. The light on the fields. The specific flat English afternoon light that hits harvested land from a low angle and makes it glow the color of old brass. The kind of light you don't see unless you're looking for it. The kind that's been happening all your life and will keep happening long after. He thought about the Dr. Doreen had described. 42 years of nights. 3 years of not knowing what to do with his hands. His body finding a way to stop. He thought, not me. And this time when the second thought came, how would I know if it was? He had a different answer. He'd know because he'd learned what it felt like to look up, because he'd stood on a bridge in the dark and let the light land on him instead of moving through it on his way to somewhere else. Because a woman named Doreen had placed fish on a railing at 5 a.m. for 8 years without anyone paying her to do it, without anyone watching, without any reason beyond the fact that it was worth doing. Because a heron had looked at him with one yellow eye and found him unremarkable, and somehow that had been the exact right thing. The train came into the station at 3:15. Collins was on the platform, standing large in his civvies, hands in pockets, pretending to look at his phone, very obviously not pretending. Marcus got off the train. Collins looked up, looked at him for a second. The particular look of a man assessing whether his friend is all right in the real sense and not the phone call sense. You look different, Collins said. Doi. Yeah. Collins fell into step beside him. Can't place it. Like some things I don't know. Settle. Marcus picked up his bag. They walked toward the exit. Henderson's at 8, Collins said. I know. You eaten anything since the croissant? Sandwich on the train. Right. Collins pushed the door open. Good. Outside, the city in the late afternoon light. Cold, clear, the same cold that had been on the bridge and the river and the bench by the Thames, the same October everywhere at once. Marcus stopped for just a second on the pavement outside the station. Looked up. The sky, above the rooftops and the signal gantries and the pedestrian bridge overhead, just ordinary late afternoon sky. Nothing dramatic, no color yet too early, the light still white and flat. But in an hour it would do something. He knew that now. He'd carry that with him. The way a light always does something, even when no one is watching. Especially then,